That night, loneliness sat at the table before I even noticed it was there. And now tell me, how many times have you prepared something with love for someone who didn't bother to show up? Because as I smoothed the clean cloth over the wood, something inside me already knew that this dinner carried more than aromas and memories. It carried destiny, the kind of destiny we try to avoid, but that insists on finding us in the simplest detail, like an empty plate waiting for someone who isn't coming. I arranged the silverware with the same care I used when she was little, when she ran through the house laughing, begging to sit by my side, when the table was full of life, noise, movement, and I believed that sound would never fade. But time, that silent craftsman, works in ways we never predict. It recalculates stories, shapes silences, transforms habits, rearranges priorities. And that night, while the pot still released steam and the smell of seasoning drifted through the house, I felt that the table was different. Not because the tablecloth had changed, not because the dishes were new, but because the heart I had always expected to sit there no longer lived in the same time I did. There are memories hiding in the simple act of setting a table. We think we're just placing a plate, but in truth, we're summoning moments. I remembered her small hands tapping on the wood to get my attention. I remembered the days when she sat down before everyone else, with that wild hunger for life only children have. I remembered the times I said dinner was ready, and she came running, almost tripping, because she didn't want to miss a thing. It was the only kind of rush I ever wanted to see, the only urgency that filled my chest with joy. And yet, there I was, at that same table, in that same house, arranging everything alone, realizing her urgency now moved in a direction far from mine. The cloth seemed whiter than usual, maybe because it contrasted with the absence I kept trying to ignore. Each well-aligned fold carried the weight of years of dedication, of meals filled with meaning, of a routine built with care and offered with open hands. The table wasn't just furniture, it was an altar. It was the place where I poured affection without saying a word, where I did what I've always done best, care. And caring has always been my purest form of loving. But that night, as I placed her plate exactly where she always liked it, something in me began to understand that this care might be falling into a heart that no longer saw its worth. The house was quiet, but not a usual quiet. It was the kind of silence that warns you, that nudges you, that whispers without words that something is shifting. And we feel it. I felt it. The smell of steaming rice seemed stronger, as if trying to fill a void no food could ever occupy. The pot of beans bubbled on low heat, almost as if it still believed someone would walk through the door. And I stirred everything with the calm of someone who knows every detail of the ritual, someone who learned early that love lives in the smallest things, and that a set table is a silent declaration of devotion. Only this time, my devotion felt too big for the absence I sensed approaching. And before I continue this story, I want you to write in the comments where you're listening from. Your city, your state, your country. Because this table isn't just mine. This ritual doesn't belong only to my home. This story crosses borders and reaches women and men who, at some point in life, have set a table for someone who never came. This pain is more common than people admit, and maybe you'll recognize yourself in this stretched cloth, this warm meal, this untouched plate. I adjusted her chair with the same care as always. I touched the backrest as if I could still feel her presence there. Our bodies don't let go of habits easily, even when life insists on showing that they no longer make sense. As I placed the glass on the right side of the plate, I remembered all the times she said only I knew how to prepare things the way she liked. A small sentence, but one that filled my heart in a way nothing else could. Because when a child recognizes a mother's care, the whole world feels like it falls into place. But when that recognition fades, when routine becomes obligation, when affection turns into background noise, the table starts revealing what the heart tries to hide. I took a deep breath, holding inside me the hope that had sustained me so many times before. The hope that despite her busy life, despite the emotional distance, despite the choices that pulled us apart, she would still see the value in what I did. I never asked for much, never demanded more than the necessary. I have always believed that love proves itself in the small acts of being present. And that night, I wanted that presence back. Just that. A presence. A gesture. A door opening. A step. A simple hello. Anything that whispered, I still remember you. But the clock kept marking time, as if it wanted to show me that the waiting had begun long before I realized it. Dinner was ready. The table was beautiful. Everything in its place, just as it always had been. But inside, something wasn't in place, because a set table is not just decoration. It is expectation. It is memory. It is a promise of togetherness. And when the promise isn't fulfilled, the table stops being a table and becomes a mirror. A mirror reflecting the distance the other person created. A mirror showing the emptiness someone left behind. A mirror forcing us to face that the love we receive isn't always equal to the love we give. And as I walked around the kitchen, adjusting what was already perfectly arranged, trying to fill time with tasks that fooled no one, I felt the weight of all the nights I had prepared more than a meal. I was preparing belonging, and belonging only exists when someone chooses to stay. But that night, I knew deep down that perhaps I was the only one choosing, and when only one person chooses, the table exposes it, the plate exposes it, the silence exposes it, even the smell exposes it. I touched the serving spoon as if searching for support. I felt the warmth of the pot and thought about all the mornings she woke me up saying she was hungry. So many requests, so many urgencies I answered in the moment, because being a mother is prioritizing even when the body is tired. But now, her urgencies were different, and none of them included running back home when I said dinner was ready. And that reality, even in its silence, started spreading over the table like a soft, stubborn shadow. I breathed deeply. The rising steam felt like a prayer, like a request I didn't dare speak aloud. And in that moment, between the smell of food and the weight of absence, I understood that the set table wasn't just routine. It was farewell. A farewell that had no name yet, no shape, no clear form, but was already walking toward me. And, still, I remained there, standing, insisting on believing she would walk through the door and sit in her place just like before, like always, like never again. And as the night pushed forward, the table continued glowing under the dim light of the room, as if it were waiting with me. Every detail seemed to want to tell me something I wasn't ready to hear yet, but that I knew I would have to face sooner or later. Time kept moving quickly, while I stared at that table that minutes ago felt so full of meaning. The food still released a faint steam, but I knew it would slowly begin to cool, just like so many things that had cooled between us over the years. I sat down slowly, adjusting the chair almost automatically, trying to ignore the strange feeling growing inside me. And when my eyes rested on her plate, something inside me broke with no sound. The plate was clean, perfect, untouched. No sign of presence, no fork marks, no crumbs, nothing. It was as if that plate shouted what she never had the courage to say out loud. We think abandonment is loud, that it hurts when someone slams a door, raises their voice, or turns their back. But no, the deepest abandonment is silent. It happens like this. In front of a plate that's too clean to have been used, in front of food that cools without witnesses, in front of a table set for two when only one sits down. Her plate looked exactly like our relationship, beautiful on the outside, empty on the inside, a emptiness so wide that even without sound, it filled the whole room. It was silence that spoke, and it spoke loudly. As I stared at that still, untouched plate, I felt my whole body grow heavier, as if every memory found its place in that moment. Because that plate didn't reflect a simple delay, or a distraction, or an innocent forgetfulness. It reflected every time I offered presence and received absence. Every night I prepared something special, and she simply said, "I'll be home later," never realizing that, for me, dinner was more than food. It was connection. It was relationship. It was love, served in the only way I knew how. The clock on the wall ticked in a rhythm that seemed almost cruel. Each passing second reinforced a truth I didn't want to admit. The meal was ready on time, as always. I had done everything with the smallest details in mind, as always. But she didn't come, like so many times before. And still, even knowing this, even feeling this, I sat there staring at the untouched plate as if it were a mirror that refused to soften. Because that plate reflected more than her absence. It reflected the part of me still clinging to the idea that one day everything would return to how it once was. The silence thickened, first around my ears, then in my chest, then all through the room. And the more it grew, the more I understood that this moment wasn't about a missed dinner. It was about all the dinners I sat through alone, all the conversations I saved for the day she might have more time, all the stories I held back because, when she did come home, she was too tired to listen, and I always told myself, tomorrow I'll tell her, tomorrow we'll talk, tomorrow we'll figure it out. Except her tomorrow never matched mine. I touched my fork with no real intention of eating. Hunger had nothing to do with that moment. What I needed was to understand where I had gotten lost on this one-sided road. The fork made the faintest sound when it hit the plate, but inside me, it echoed like a crack. Because in that small gesture, I realized I was trying to fill a void that wasn't mine. Her absence wasn't my fault, yet I carried it as if it were. The food began to cool, and with it, I lost the last excuses I had held on to. There was no traffic that could justify this, no unexpected call, no urgency that could explain so many times she chose any place over the table where I'd waited through all her childhood. And at that point, my heart began to understand something my mind had resisted. For years, the untouched plate said more than any explanation she might offer later. It was already the full truth, a truth cold, sharp, and undeniable, and I could no longer turn away from it. I looked around the room, searching for a reason to keep believing. The shadows cast by the lights stretched across the furniture, creating the impression that everything in the house understood this story better than I did, as if the walls knew that this scene wasn't new, that this empty plate was repetition, that this silence had been built little by little, like someone removing one brick a day from an important wall until it begins to collapse. And there I sat, trying to hold the rubble in my hands, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. It's strange how objects become witnesses to things we don't say. The white tablecloth felt heavier, as if it carried tears I hadn't shed yet. The glass beside her plate looked as full of air as her heart seemed full of distance. Even the chair felt pushed back, as if it somehow knew its place had been slowly abandoned long before tonight. And then a memory hit me, so vivid I could almost smell the past. I saw her small again, climbing into that chair with effort, hair messy, face lit with joy. That smile guided me through so many years, and now, seeing the untouched plate before me, felt like watching that childhood disappear in one brutal, quiet instant. I inhaled deeply, but the air felt thick. Her absence filled the room like a heavy, invisible wall, and the longer I stared at that clean plate, the more I understood that the weight wasn't in the food growing cold. The weight was in everything she didn't say, everything she didn't do, everything she didn't choose. Because presence is a choice, care is a choice, love is a choice, and she hadn't chosen to be there. Not that night, not the nights before, not in the many moments when I prepared something hoping she'd notice the meaning behind the gesture. I know many people have lived something like this. So if you've ever stared at an empty plate waiting for someone who never came, write in the comments, "I know how it feels." That simple phrase carries the power of those who recognize their own story reflected in someone else's silence. Because that untouched plate wasn't just a sign of absence. It was a sign that I had been carrying alone, a ritual that once belonged to both of us. The light in the room began to soften. Not because the bulb dimmed, but because my heart was beginning to see everything more clearly. It was astonishing how this ordinary object, a simple clean plate, had become the greatest symbol of the distance between us. It spoke, and it spoke directly to me. It told me to stop pretending nothing was happening. It told me to look at what was right in front of me. It told me that the relationship I'd been trying so hard to preserve was being held up by only one pair of hands. And when I finally allowed myself to see beyond the plate, I realized that the silence filling the house was leading me toward a truth I wasn't fully prepared to understand. Part of me wanted to get up, put everything away, pretend it was just another ordinary evening. But another part, deeper, wiser, more wounded and more awake, knew I needed to stay there a little longer. Because in that silence, a truth was forming. Not a cruel truth, but a necessary one. And even with my heart tightening, I had to let that truth grow until it found its own name. And it was in that very moment, when silence became larger than any word, that something inside me began to shift, signaling that the next movement of the night wouldn't come from the door opening, but from within me. It was in that quiet opening inside the room that something old began to stir in me, as if long asleep memories were returning to fill the empty chairs around me. Because before absence ever hurt this deeply, there was a time when the table meant presence. There was a time when dinner time meant joy, connection, routine, tenderness. And as I sat there staring at the untouched plate, I began to see scenes that didn't belong to the present, but to years ago, when my daughter ran through the house without realizing her footsteps filled every corner. It was as if the past had been pulled straight into the present, breaking into fragments that spread across the table with the same intensity as the longing in my chest. I saw her small again, climbing onto her chair with effort, wiggling so she wouldn't fall, laughing before even tasting the food. I remembered the way she would tap her spoon on the plate, impatient, declaring she was hungry. She talked about her day as if every detail were a treasure, and I listened with eyes that understood childhood doesn't last forever. And I remembered the way she'd look at me in gratitude, saying everything without speaking a word, because children love like that, purely, fearlessly, completely. Back then, the table was full of stories, full of life, full of us. The sound that hurts me today, silence, didn't exist back then. The house was filled with the noise of pots, laughter, small feet rushing back and forth. The table was messy in ways that made my heart happy. Crumbs I wiped off with tenderness because they showed she had been there. Spilled cups, wrinkled napkins, stories interrupted by giggles and requests for dessert. And I, who now stare at a plate too clean, once looked at that childhood, chaos, as if it were sacred. Because it was. That routine was where I found my purpose, my place, my identity as a mother. Sometimes I close my eyes and still hear her voice calling, "Mom, come sit with me." It was always like that. She wanted my presence. She wanted my warmth. She wanted my food. She wanted my stories. And I gave everything with a love so wide I'm still amazed at where I stored so much. I believed that bond was eternal, because no one teaches a mother how to imagine the day her child no longer has time for her. But life has its own rhythm, and when her childhood ended, the footsteps softened, the laughter faded, our schedules drifted apart, and I realized, too late, that silence had started entering our home without knocking. As I looked at the untouched plate, all those memories washed over me like waves that don't wait to be invited, and it hurt. It hurt because I wondered when the table began to lose its shine, when food stopped being an invitation and turned into an obligation, when I stopped being her priority and became just another item on her list of things to fit into her busy routine. And even knowing life works this way, my heart still asked, not the world, but myself, at what moment did I stop being home? Nostalgia is tricky. It embraces you softly one minute and tightens its grip the next. I saw her swinging her legs beneath the table, hair messy, face covered in food, and my heart warmed. But then I saw the same chair empty today, and the pain returned, reminding me that this contrast isn't imaginary. It's real. The table full of memories doesn't match the silence that now rules dinner time. And it's this brutal difference that hurts more than any harsh word someone could say. Then I noticed something that made me breathe deeper. The tablecloth I used back then, the faded floral one, was the same one I had laid out tonight. I kept it for years, like an emotional keepsake. And when I spread it across the table today, I didn't realize that gesture carried an unconscious attempt to revive a time when life felt lighter. Now, looking at it, I see that every faded flower holds a memory. I remember when she spilled juice on it and cried, thinking she had ruined something precious. I remember when she got covered in flour and ran around the house looking like a little cloud. I remember when she accidentally scribbled on it and apologized with eyes so sincere I couldn't bring myself to be upset. That tablecloth carried everything, except the present, and I began to understand that no matter how much I live in the now, the past still sits with me at every meal. It never leaves the table. It pulls out a chair, unfolds a napkin, fills my plate with memories, and at the same time empties my heart when I realize that time will never return. The present is an empty chair. The past is a child running through the room. And I am somewhere between those two worlds, trying to figure out how to live with both without breaking. I know many. Mothers have lived this. I know many women have felt this mixture of longing and loneliness that arrives without permission. So if your table also carries the ghosts of childhood, write in the comments. I remember the full table too. It's astonishing how these stories recognize each other, how every woman who has lived this cycle understands the depth of this quiet pain. It isn't just abandonment, it's transformation. It's a shift in place within the life of someone who once fit entirely in your arms. And as the memories moved through me, I realized it wasn't just longing for the past visiting me. It was a new understanding of the present, because by remembering everything we once were, I began to see more clearly what we were no longer. It was as if each old laugh collided with the current silence and revealed an emotional gap I had been trying to patch with hopes too fragile to hold together, a relationship slowly drifting away from me. The table was still set, but now I no longer saw the food. I saw the contrast. I saw the emptiness. I saw the space between who I once was to her and who she is to me now. And the more I looked at it, the more I understood that this dinner wasn't showing only her physical absence. It was showing the emotional absence that had been growing for years, so slowly that I needed a moment like this to finally accept that something precious was slipping away. And it was right there, sitting between who I once was and who I still try to be, that I felt. That night had something bigger to reveal to me, something I still didn't have the courage to fully admit, but that was already taking shape inside me, like a truth approaching slowly, waiting for just one more gesture before becoming impossible to ignore. I stayed there, with memories still hanging in the air, trying to understand at which point in life time started running in only one direction. The table was still set, every detail in its place, but the empty chair beside me seemed to grow, to take up space, to breathe. It was strange how something so simple could carry so many layers of meaning. I always thought the weight of absence came from the people who didn't show up, but I realized that sometimes the deepest pain comes from what stays still. The chair that waits and never receives, the plate that stays untouched, the space that no longer fills. The empty chair was an open wound, silent, exposed, and even then, I tried to justify it. The mind, when it wants to protect the heart, becomes an expert at creating sweet lies that soothe even when they make no sense. Maybe she was stuck in traffic. Maybe something urgent came up. Maybe she forgot the time. Maybe she was too tired. Maybe. I clung to these possibilities with the same desperation as someone hanging onto a rope about to snap. But deep down, where truth lives and refuses to be ignored, I knew none of it held up. The silence in the house, mixed with the smell of food beginning to cool, pushed me gently toward that painful awareness, because waiting has its own kind of exhaustion, a different kind, not the kind that drains the body, but the kind that wears out the soul. It's the emotional heaviness that builds when you keep believing in something that no longer exists. And I began to feel that exhaustion climbing my legs, settling heavily in my chest, tightening my breath. It was as if each passing minute took away another bit of the strength I'd used for so long to justify what had no justification. The empty chair felt like it was staring back at me. I looked away, and it remained where it was, steady, as if demanding I acknowledge what was happening. For a moment, I wanted to stand up and put everything away, pretend none of it mattered, like I had done so many times before. Fold the tablecloth, stack the plates, turn off the lights, and go through the night as if my soul hadn't been carved open a little. But something inside me, deeper and older, asked me to stay, as if I needed to feel the discomfort all the way through in order to finally understand what time had been trying to tell me. I touched the edge of her chair with my fingertips, and the coldness of the wood sent a shiver through me. It wasn't just physical absence, it was emotional absence, lack of priority, a silent confirmation that, to her, my presence no longer held the same value. And that hurt not like one big blow, but like a series of tiny cuts, so subtle they almost go unnoticed, but so constant they eventually scar the soul, a kind of pain mothers know well, but rarely admit. The hardest part is that love insists on trying. It tries to believe, tries to wait, tries to understand. Love invents reasons, builds imaginary explanations, creates comforting stories to shield the one we love from painful truth. How many times did I say, "It's okay," when it wasn't? How many times did I minimize her absence so I wouldn't seem needy, so I wouldn't burden her, so I wouldn't show how much I longed for something as simple as presence? And how many times did that same understanding become an emotional prison where only I made the effort? As these thoughts moved through me, I realized this wasn't the first time that chair had stayed empty longer than it should. It wasn't the first time I prepared something with love and received silence in return. It wasn't the first time I rearranged my day for her, while she shifted hers without considering mine. The truth is that abandonment rarely arrives all at once. It builds slowly, almost invisibly, like a crack in a wall that widens just a little each day. You don't see the danger until things begin to collapse. The empty chair carried all those cracks. It knew more about our story than I was willing to admit. And in a way, it felt humiliating to realize that an object understood my loneliness better than the person who should have been sitting in it. I stared at that space and felt as if I were looking directly at the reflection of my own disproportionate giving. I gave everything. She returned crumbs. And there, for the first time, I began to admit how deeply that imbalance had been hurting me. Quietly, continuously, relentlessly. I took a deep breath, trying to contain the sense of abandonment spreading through my chest like water through broken tiles. It was inevitable, and I knew it. The empty chair wasn't just absence, it was insignificance. And that word, when it settles in a mother's heart, has a weight that's hard to describe. It's as if all the years of care, dedication, sacrifice were suddenly questioned by one simple gesture: not showing up. It's cruel how the absence of a single night can rewrite the story of an entire life. The room's light seemed to dim slowly, as if recognizing the pain of that waiting. I realized I kept searching for signs that weren't real. A sound at the door, a car passing outside, a phone vibrating that never vibrated. The mind creates illusions when the heart refuses to accept what it already knows. I found myself glancing at the clock again and again, as if that could speed up time, or freeze it, or somehow bring back the feeling that hope was still possible. But the clock kept moving, unbothered, uninterested, honest. And then a thought crossed my mind, one I didn't want to admit, but that suddenly made perfect sense. The chair is empty only because I am the only one still trying to fill it. That realization fell over me like a slow-moving shadow, darkening parts of me I had always kept lit. It was hard to accept. It felt unfair, but it was real. The empty chair was proof that I had been carrying on a connection alone, one that hadn't been mutual for a long time. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, not the kind that comes from the body, but the kind that rises from the soul. And in that moment, I felt the impulse to ask those listening to write in the comments. I felt that empty chair too, because it's never just a piece of furniture. It's a symbol of waiting that goes beyond the physical and reaches the emotional. A symbol of longing for someone who's alive, but no longer present. A symbol of the pain of realizing that sometimes loving someone means accepting they're not willing to love you back with the same intensity. Time kept passing, and I remained there, still on the outside, but completely shaken inside. The empty chair seemed to speak to me in a way I had never heard before, as if saying, "Do you see? This is the size of the space she left behind." And the more I stared at that space, the more a truth began forming inside me. A truth I wasn't ready to speak out loud, but that was ready to rise the moment I took the next step in that night, determined to teach me more than I felt prepared to learn. And it was at that exact moment, between the empty chair and the one where I still forced myself to stay strong, that I felt something inside me begin to shift, something deep, old, and necessary, something that could no longer be ignored. Because the empty chair wasn't just absence, it was the beginning of a revelation approaching slowly, ready to change everything I believed about love, reciprocity, presence, and, most of all, my own worth. Even when someone I love chooses not to sit beside me anymore, I was still there, sitting at that table that held more memories than the house itself, when something inside me began to look beyond the empty chair, not at the physical space, but at the story behind the absence. Because no one stops showing up out of nowhere. No one pulls their heart away in an instant. When someone stops returning home, it's not because they forgot the way. It's because, little by little, they drifted away from themselves, and in that drifting, they carried away those who loved them. And that was when I realized that night wasn't speaking only about my pain. It was speaking about the woman my daughter had become, and the one I kept trying to understand, even when everything in me whispered that she no longer fit in the life I had always offered. She grew up in a world that demanded speed, a world where the clock is worth more than a hug, where time is measured in deadlines, where life runs so fast no one sits down to breathe anymore. I watched her study, work, chase after everything she believed mattered, and I was proud in my own way. No mother raises a daughter to stay small. I wanted her to have opportunities I never had. I wanted her to reach what I only dreamed of. But while she grew into the world, I didn't realize she was shrinking inside our home. And this is the kind of change you only notice when it's already too late. The adult daughter I had now, even in her absence, was not the same little girl who ran to the table asking for food and attention at the same time. Now she ran after deadlines, goals, recognition that doesn't fill the heart, but that she believes she needs to prove herself. I see a woman exhausted, swallowed by her own routine, too, busy to look back, too overwhelmed to notice the love that carried her through her whole life still waits for her. And what hurts most is knowing that in this relentless chase, affection becomes the first thing she treats as optional, as something she can postpone. She became someone who always says, "Not now, Mom. Later, Mom. Another time, Mom." And I learned to accept those laters the way someone starving accepts crumbs. But as the years passed, those laters slowly turned into never. And while the mother in me tried to understand, tried to justify, tried to be patient, the woman in me began to feel the weight of that neglect. Because love is presence, and no one survives on memories alone. Modern life defeated her affection, but not all at once. It was a slow defeat. First, she stopped sitting down to talk. Then she started eating in her room because she was tired. Then she arrived home late. Then she stopped letting me know. Then she began treating visits like obligations, tasks, to check off. And the worst part? She didn't notice that while I waited for her, she no longer waited for me. Not because she didn't love me. I still believe she does, in the broken way she learned. But because she lost herself in a world that demands too much and gives too little back. I saw her phone always ringing. Messages, alerts, responsibilities that never ended. And somewhere along the way, I realized I was competing for space with an entire universe she couldn't control. Technology took the place of conversation. Work took the place of presence. Speed took the place of peace. And I began to understand that she wasn't just distant from me. She was distant from herself. She became someone who tries to fit emotion into the small gaps of her schedule, as if affection were something you could plan into your day. And even then, even seeing all that, I tried to understand. I tried to justify her actions. I tried to believe she would one day look up, breathe, and return to me the way she once did. But the truth is, adult life devours people. It devours without mercy. And my daughter was swallowed in a way that made her forget that love needs nourishment too. That bonds die when they're left unattended. That relationships, like dinners, grow cold when no one takes a seat at the table. I know some people say children owe nothing to their parents, but that's not what I'm talking about. This isn't about debt. It's about humanity. It's about care. It's about acknowledging who was there before the world even knew your name. It's about looking at a set table and remembering that before any degree, any promotion, any victory, there was a mother here teaching you how to walk. And even with all of that, the adult daughter she became learned to prioritize everything except what truly matters. And that's where a mother's heart divides itself. Because while I feel the wound of her absence, I also feel something like pity, not for me, but for her. Because she doesn't realize what she's losing. She doesn't see the richness in something as simple as sitting down to share a meal with someone who loves her. She doesn't see how life hurts when you think you can postpone love. Life doesn't wait. Affection doesn't wait. Time doesn't wait. And when the rush finally ends and loneliness arrives, there is no job that comforts, no money that heals, no achievement that fills the empty space left by what was never lived. That's why sometimes, looking at her life from afar, I realize that although I'm the one sitting here hurting, she's the one who's truly lost. And that realization hurts almost as much as her absence. The truth is, life defeated her affection only because she allowed it. She believes being busy means being important, that running endlessly means she's succeeding, that putting off love means she's being mature. But real maturity is something else entirely. It is recognizing the value of the relationships that built you. It is knowing that no one lives off external victories alone. There are internal victories worth far more, and presence is one of them. I started to see that this wasn't something new. It was repetition. It was routine. It was a pattern. It wasn't one forgotten dinner. It was a way of living. And that made me revisit so many nights when something similar happened, nights I brushed off as small details. Abandonment rarely arrives loudly. First, it appears as emotional distance, then as lack of priority, then as silence. And by the time you realize it, the table is set and the chair is empty, not for the first time, but for the 100th. And you finally see you've been waiting alone for years. I want to ask those listening to write in the comments, I've been pushed aside by someone I love, because there is no pain more common and yet more silent than this one. The pain of being forgotten by someone you once held in your arms. The pain of realizing that the child you raised for the world no longer recognizes you inside it. And it was right at that point, between understanding and the wound, that I realized the night still had a bigger revelation waiting, something that didn't come from the empty chair or the untouched plate or the table full of memories. It came from her, from the adult woman my daughter had become, the one I kept reaching for even though she now lived in another rhythm, another world, another emotional universe that no longer included me the way it once did. And as this understanding settled, inside me I felt the next truth approaching, like someone walking through a dark house knowing something important waits in the next room. And I, even hurting, knew I had to keep going, because the night hadn't finished telling me what it came to tell. When I looked again at her plate, still flawless, still clean, still as white as when I set it down, something inside me finally broke. Not loudly, not in a scream, not in anger. It was a quiet breaking, invisible on the outside, but devastating within. Because in that moment, in that untouched plate, I saw everything I had spent years trying not to see. Her absence wasn't in the late hour, or the unopened door, or the message that never came. Her absence was in the emptiness placed right in front of me, as if saying without a single word, I don't belong at your table anymore. The food was cold now, but the truth carried by that plate had been cold from the beginning. Some absences arrive like wind, some like storms, and some arrive like untouched plates, silent, precise, impossible to justify. It was as if life had served me raw reality, unseasoned, unsoftened. And the reality was this: she didn't reject the meal. She rejected the place I held in her life. And understanding that tore open a corner of my heart I thought was still protected. I ran my fingers along the edge of her plate as if touching a memory. It was strange to look at it and feel the weight of a truth too large for any word. The plate, so empty and so spotless, carried more history than it would have if it were full. I found myself staring at a symbol that left no space for fantasy, for excuses, for hopeful illusions. It wasn't lack of appetite. It wasn't distraction. It wasn't exhaustion. It was a decision, a silent decision made long before tonight, that the table that once felt like home was now just a setting she no longer recognized. And the cruelest part was that I felt this truth before I understood it. My body knew. My heart knew. Some pains are sensed long before they're spoken, because the body always notices what the mind refuses to see. The cooling food didn't hurt me. What broke me was knowing that I had placed far more than rice and beans on that table. I had placed memory, affection, tradition, longing, effort, care, love. And she didn't come to receive any of it. Not the meal, not the love. And when someone rejects what comes from your hands, it's not the gesture they're rejecting. It's you. The silence in the room grew so dense it felt like it was breathing with me. I heard the ticking of the clock like a hammer tapping inside my chest, marking every second that confirmed her absence. Each minute whispered, "She isn't coming. Not this time, not tonight, and maybe never again in the way you're waiting for." And in that invisible repetition, life showed me that some truths aren't shouted. They arrive slowly, until there's nowhere left to hide. I tried in every way not to drown in that blow, tried to convince myself she might still arrive, that something unexpected must have happened, that maybe she simply mixed up the time. But the problem wasn't the physical absence, it was the emotional one. It was the fact that even if she walked through the door that very minute, the emptiness of that plate had already said everything she never dared to say. "You are not my priority anymore." The set table, once a symbol of comfort and closeness, now looked like an altar of farewell. Every detail I arranged with so much love, the folded napkin, the stretched tablecloth, the aligned silverware, now screamed her absence in a way that cut deeply. I felt that table was witnessing more than a missed dinner. It was witnessing the end of a cycle I had been trying desperately to keep alive. And at that moment, something crossed my mind that I wish those listening would write in the comments. Absence speaks too. Because it does. It speaks loudly. It speaks clearly. It speaks without mercy. Sometimes the greatest pain doesn't come from what someone says. It comes from what they choose not to do. And her absence that night told me everything I needed to finally understand that I had been fighting alone for a long time. I stood up slowly, not because my body was tired, but because truth, when it finally settles, has a heaviness that sinks into your bones. I placed my hand on the table's edge, feeling the wood firm, steady, present. The table hadn't abandoned me. The dinner hadn't abandoned me. Everything was there. And that made her absence even more painfully clear. Because sometimes what wounds us isn't what leaves. It's what stays and witnesses the empty space. I looked at her plate again, trying to understand why such a simple object hurt so deeply. And then I realized that the untouched plate didn't represent just that night. It represented every time she left me waiting emotionally, every conversation she avoided, every hug she didn't give, every call she ignored, every meeting she postponed until it disappeared. The plate was the perfect summary of everything I tried to nourish in our relationship, and she refused to receive. And that was when I understood that truth, when it arrives, is always cold. It doesn't come with warmth, or comfort, or explanation. It arrives cold like forgotten food, cold like an untouched plate, cold like unanswered silence. And still, it is the only thing that can pull us out of illusions we've held onto for too long. I felt my eyes burn, not only from sadness, but from the sudden understanding that this moment was marking something profound within me. I had always believed love was persistence, that staying was proof of affection, that waiting was loyalty. But that night, I understood that waiting for someone who doesn't come is abandoning yourself. And I had been far from myself for years. As I took a deep breath, I tried to accept that maybe life was using that exact dinner to reveal something I never wanted to face. Sometimes, truth only arrives when it hurts, because pain opens the cracks where clarity can finally enter. And clarity told me that her plate wasn't empty of food, it was empty of us, empty of connection, empty of reciprocation, empty of willingness, empty of love that shows up. And that emptiness, even cold, began turning into awareness. Awareness that maybe I had been holding this bond too tightly while she held it too loosely. Awareness that love can't survive when only one person takes care of it. Awareness that I needed to listen to what her absence was saying, even if it hurt, even if it burned, even if it broke what little illusion I had left. I stepped back and looked at the table as if I were looking at my own life. Everything neatly arranged, prepared, given with love. Everything ready for someone who didn't come. And I realized, with a pain that stretched deep into my soul, that the table was the exact reflection of who I had become. Someone who prepares everything, gives everything, devotes everything, and receives silence in return. And that's why I want you to write in the comments, "I deserve presence," because that truth needs to enter your heart the same way it entered mine that night. Presence is the minimum. Presence is respect. Presence is love. And as that awareness took shape inside me, I realized the night still held another step, a step that didn't end at the table, something waiting to be lived with honesty, courage, and calm, because her absence had spoken. But I still needed to understand what to do with what I'd heard, and that was exactly what life was about to show me. When I finally took the first step toward the sink, my body felt heavier, as if every movement carried the weight of all the truths I had just swallowed. It wasn't only the food that had gone cold, it was the expectation, the hope, the old illusion that she would one day run toward me again, like she did when she was a child. The walk to the sink looked short, but inside me it was long, full of memories knocking inside my chest like doors closing slowly. And even so, I walked, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. Because some pains only transform when you let them carry you all the way through. I picked up her plate gently, as if holding an entire story in my hands. The plate was light, yet the truth it carried was too heavy to ignore. I pressed it briefly against my chest, taking a slow breath, almost like someone saying goodbye to something they've held onto for far too long. And in that small gesture, something inside me began to shift, as if pain were giving way to a quiet pride, a strength I didn't know I still had. Before washing the plate, I looked at it one last time, and the first thought that came to me was, I deserve more than this. And that thought echoed inside me like a firm whisper, an old reminder I had forgotten to hear. The water running in the sink felt as cold as the night. As it flowed, I sensed it carrying away not just the remains of dinner, but also the remains of a waiting that no longer belonged to me. Each motion of the sponge against the plate felt like a ritual of closure, a gesture sealing a door I was finally deciding to shut. And the strangest thing was that, for the first time, I felt no anger, no resentment, no urge to scream. The pain was still there, throbbing softly, but beside it rose something new, dignity. And dignity comes slowly, like someone approaching on tiptoe, not wanting to scare you. It came in small realizations that kept growing inside me. The realization that I shouldn't have to beg for presence, that I shouldn't have to plead for attention, that even a mother grows tired of waiting, tired of justifying, tired of carrying alone a bond that should be held by two. And as I rinsed the plate, that exhaustion began turning into clarity. Clarity of self-love, clarity of boundaries, clarity that even in my pain, I still belonged to myself. I placed her plate on the drying rack with the kind of care that felt almost ceremonial, as if putting that plate away symbolized storing a chapter of my life I was ready to leave behind. And the moment I set it down, I felt something inside me awaken after years of sleeping. A silent strength, a strength that didn't come from the world but from inside, a place carved by pain but ready to bloom. And that was when I realized washing that plate wasn't humiliation, it was liberation. I returned to the table and began gathering the silverware. The cold metal brushed against my fingers, and for the first time I noticed that even the objects reflected my loneliness. Still, there was beauty in that silence, a beauty born from truth, from raw reality, from honesty finally standing without disguise. Each piece of silverware I collected felt like it lifted away a fragment of the fantasy I had carried for so long. And with each one, my chest felt as if it were rearranging itself, shaping a new version of me. The sigh, chair where she should have been, was still there, untouched by her presence. I ran my hand along the back of it and realized that wood held more of her history than the woman who once sat there. How many times had that chair supported her small frame? How many laughs did it hear? How many secrets? And now it sat empty, cold, distant. The chair seemed to ask, "Why do you still wait?" And for the first time, without speaking aloud, I began to answer, "Because I learned to love all the way, to the limit. But now I'm learning to love what's left of me, too." When I finally finished putting everything away, I turned to switch off the kitchen light. And that gesture, so simple, so ordinary, took on a meaning I wasn't expecting. As I reached my hand toward the switch, I realized that light no longer illuminated any kind of hope. It only revealed an empty table, a loud absence, a silence I no longer needed to feed. Turning off the light at that moment felt like closing a book I had read for far too long, a book I knew by heart, but one that no longer belonged to me. When the kitchen fell into shadow, I felt a strange kind of peace. A peace that didn't come from joy, but from acceptance. It was as if the darkness whispered, "Now you can hear yourself. Now you can feel. Now you can find your way back to you." And I stayed there for a few seconds, letting that darkness wrap itself around what still hurt. Because some wounds only begin to heal when we stop shining light on places where there is no reciprocity. I took a deep breath and let the air enter slowly, like someone gathering courage, and in that moment, a sensation spread across my chest. Pride. A different pride. Quiet, steady, mature. Pride for having loved. Pride for having tried. Pride for being present. Pride for setting that table with care, even knowing she might not value it. Pride for not hardening my heart. Pride for realizing that, despite everything, I could still feel. And that quiet pride began to fill a space that pain had ruled for far too long. And that's why I want to ask those listening to write in the comments. I choose to respect myself, because this phrase is more than a comment. It's a commitment, a reminder, an emotional anchor. It's a way of telling yourself that self-love exists, even when others try to convince you that you were born only to serve. The kitchen was dark, but inside me a new flame began to rise. A soft flame, but persistent. A flame whispering that this night, painful as it was, would not be remembered only for her absence, but for the beginning of my presence with myself. And the further I walked away from the kitchen, the more I felt a cycle closing, even though I didn't yet know what the next step would be. And it was with that feeling, a mixture of farewell and rebirth, that I moved into the living room, carrying with me the certainty that the truth revealed by that cold plate still had more to show me. Because deep in my chest, I knew that night wasn't over. Life still had another revelation prepared for me, something that would come as shadow, memory, or light, and I still needed to walk through it before discovering what came next. As I left the kitchen behind and walked away from the silent table, I felt that each step was like crossing a bridge made of memories, wounds, and awakenings. The living room was dark, but the darkness didn't scare me. What truly touched me was the light beginning to rise inside me, small, timid, but determined, as if it finally knew it was time to exist. There, in that silence so deep it felt sacred, I began to understand the real meaning of loving someone who doesn't return. And that understanding didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves, soft and steady, washing over my chest until I was finally able to hear them. I had always believed that loving meant staying even when it's exhausting, staying even when it hurts, staying even when the other person doesn't give anything back. And that belief, beautiful in theory, became a prison when applied to someone who never learned to stay. I realized, standing there in that silent room, that I had spent much of my life offering love to someone who didn't know how to receive it, waiting for someone who only knew how to leave, saving a place for someone who never saved one for me. And when that awareness finally settled in, it found a heart ready to accept it, a heart ready for truth. Loving someone who doesn't return is a kind of wear that doesn't show on the face at first, but slowly corrodes the soul. Day after day, gesture after gesture, silence after silence. It creates a wound no one can see, but one that grows inside us like a constant echo. An echo that says, maybe one day she'll come back. Maybe one day she'll notice. Maybe one day she'll understand. And that maybe is cruel, because it's what keeps us trapped in illusion. But that night, after setting the table alone and walking to the sink with a heart full of aching memories, I began to see that love isn't built on maybes. True love is built on presence, on care, on intention, on reciprocity. I sat on the couch like someone who needs to rest, not the body, but the soul. With every breath, life showed me how much I had stretched myself to love someone who had been distant for a long time. Even while standing in the same house, emotional abandonment is silent, discreet, and because of that, it wounds even deeper. It happens in small gestures, small words, in the look that no longer shines when it finds you. We feel it long before we understand it. And when we finally understand, the weight is devastating. That's how the truth began to reveal itself to me that night. Slowly, gently, but firmly, like someone who knows the time has come. I understood that loving someone who doesn't return is not proof of love. It is proof that, for too long, I placed another person at the center of my life while pushing myself to the edges of my own story. How many times did I stop serving myself to serve her? How many times did I silence my own needs to hear hers? How many times did I ignore my exhaustion just to avoid being a burden? And what did I receive in return? An empty table, an untouched plate, an absence louder than any spoken word. As I thought about this, a deep ache struck my chest, not from resentment, but from recognition, recognizing that I abandoned myself many times to avoid being abandoned by others, recognizing that I always played the role of the one who solves, who comforts, who endures, who is available. And because of that, many believed they could walk away without losing me, because I would always be there, waiting. But waiting drains you. Waiting dries you out. Waiting hardens you. And I was too tired to keep living as someone eternally available to those who only showed up when they needed something. The room was quiet, but inside me a truth was screaming, a truth I had ignored for years. I also deserved someone who came back. I also deserved care. I also deserved presence. And not just any presence, genuine presence, committed presence, presence that didn't require excuses or endless delays. Loving someone who doesn't return taught me that dignity cannot be negotiated, respect cannot be begged for, and affection should never be treated like a debt. Self-love is not a luxury, it's a necessity. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, letting a sense of clarity move through my body. For the first time, I could look at her absence without asking for explanations, without trying to understand, without creating excuses, because some absences aren't questions, they are answers. Clear, direct answers that close chapters without saying a word. And accepting that felt like lifting a weight off my shoulders. Her absence that night told me exactly what I needed to know. Even if it hurt, I am not a priority in my daughter's life. But at the same time, that same absence revealed something I had never seen clearly before. I can be a priority in my own life. I can love myself with the love I've always given others. I can embrace myself the way I always embraced. I can protect myself the way I always protected. And this understanding was like a quiet rebirth inside me. A rebirth not born from grandness, but from humility. The humility of realizing that I had placed my happiness in the wrong hands. I looked down at my own hands, as if looking at an old companion who had stood with me through every battle. Hands that cooked, that comforted, that worked, that carried weight, that held tears, that opened doors, that caught falls. And in that instant, I realized that those hands deserved rest. They deserved tenderness. They deserved the same care they had always offered. Loving someone who doesn't return is a long road, but the end of that road always points to the same place, self-love. Then I felt the urge to ask those listening to write in the comments, I choose to love myself, because that phrase is a turning point, a defining moment, like turning a key that had been stuck inside the heart for years. When you write it, you declare that you will no longer shrink yourself, no longer break yourself into crumbs, no longer accept emotional leftovers that nourish no one. You declare that your story has worth, that your presence has worth, that your soul has worth. The night continued, silent but no longer marked by abandonment. It was a night of revelation, of alignment, of awakening. I felt a space opening inside me, a space once filled with the weight of waiting, now ready for something new. Loving someone who doesn't return taught me to look at myself with the same compassion I had always saved for others, and that compassion began to heal the parts of me that had been forgotten, neglected, abandoned. I walked to the window and looked outside. The streetlights carried on with their usual rhythm, indifferent to what was happening inside my home. And that's when I understood. Life doesn't stop because someone left you waiting. Life goes on. Life flows. Life continues. And I needed to learn to continue too. Not in the sense of forgetting, but in the sense of remembering. Remembering my worth. Remembering my strength. Remembering everything I had survived. Because the truth is, loving someone who doesn't return didn't destroy me. It revealed me. And as I watched the quiet street, I felt something inside me align, as if I were finding the beginning of a new path, a path I didn't yet know the direction of, but one that, for the first time in a long time, felt like mine. And that feeling, soft as it was, began preparing my heart for what would come next, because I knew there was still one more truth waiting to be spoken on that endless night. Standing there at the window, with the night spreading across everything around me, I felt my whole house breathing a different silence, no longer the silence of waiting, no longer the silence of abandonment. It was a silence that welcomed me, that wrapped itself around me as if saying I had finally crossed something I was meant to cross. The set table behind me no longer screamed in pain. It looked simply like a portrait of the love I know how to offer, love that was never small, never fragile, never empty. And in that moment, with that slow burning clarity rising inside me, I understood a truth that took a lifetime to form. The table was never a mistake. The table was a witness to who I am, to the woman who cared, prepared, called, waited, gave. A witness to a way of loving you don't learn from books or speeches, but through the daily gestures of someone who pours her heart even into the smallest things, folding a napkin, serving a plate, warming food meant for two that ended up feeding only one. The table was symbol, mirror, proof. And now, looking at it from the short distance between the window and the doorway, I understood that dinner didn't represent an ending. It represented the beginning of what I needed to see about myself. There is no love wasted when it comes from a true heart, even if the other person doesn't know how to receive it, even if they never return, even if they never see. The love I placed on that table is still mine, still strength, still part of who I am. Her absence didn't erase that. It simply revealed what I had been avoiding. It revealed that no matter how much I have shared the best of myself, some people simply aren't ready to recognize the value of what they receive. But recognition isn't currency. And that night, for the first time, I stopped searching for recognition and started searching for understanding. A deep understanding that doesn't hurt when it arrives, but instead brings relief. Understanding that some absences aren't rejection. They are release. Release from an emotional cycle that, familiar as it felt, no longer nourished anything inside me. Release from the idea that I needed someone else's presence to validate my worth. Release from the belief that I would only be seen if someone chose to see me. Because there, in the quiet of my home, I saw myself, and seeing myself was enough. I took a deep breath, feeling the air move through a new space inside me. The space that opens when pain finally organizes itself, when the soul finds a place to rest, when life tells you, gently and firmly, that you didn't make a mistake by loving. You simply planted your love in soil that wasn't ready to bloom. And there is no guilt in that. There is learning, there is maturity, there is healing. The table, this same table that had once been the stage for laughter, conversation, stories, and little rituals that build an entire life, now became a symbol of a chapter I was closing, not out of defeat, but out of clarity. I wasn't shutting doors, I was opening windows, creating space for a new way of existing, of prioritizing myself, of seeing myself without the fear of admitting that yes, I deserved return. I deserved reciprocity. I deserved to feel that my presence mattered, not only when it was convenient. And as that understanding expanded inside me like water finding its way even through stone, I realized that destiny has a peculiar way of arranging everything. Sometimes it uses pain to reveal truths hope tried to hide. Sometimes it places us in situations we never wanted to face, but desperately needed to overcome to rediscover our own strength. Sometimes it sits us alone at a table so we finally understand we were never truly accompanied by someone who didn't know how to stay. And that realization, harsh as it may be, brings a quiet freedom. A freedom that doesn't arrive with celebration, but with maturity. That doesn't arrive with noise, but with grace. That doesn't arrive by taking, but by returning. Returning to us everything we gave away too freely. Returning dignity. Returning worth. Returning the chance to rewrite our story without carrying weights that were never ours. The table behind me remained, untouched, and in that single detail, an inner light grew stronger. Nothing that night was wasted. Nothing in that waiting was in vain. Nothing in that empty plate was a failure. because I gave the best of myself. I offered the truest love I had, and when someone turns their back on love like that, it is not the love that loses value. It is the person who loses the chance to receive it. I turned slowly, looking once more at something I knew would soon become a memory. My home seemed to breathe with me, as if relieved that I finally understood what life was trying to show me. And at that moment, a deep serenity washed over me. Not joy, not sadness, something in between, peace. A peace that arrives when the heart accepts that not everything that hurts must be held on to. A peace that grows when the soul understands it's time to walk toward a new emotional horizon. A peace that settles in when you realize that, despite everything, you remained whole. I gently touched the back of the chair that still stood empty, but for the first time, I didn't feel the weight of her absence. I felt the weight of my own presence, my story, my strength. I felt that no matter who stays or who leaves, I remain a woman who loves, who cares, who gives, who transforms. A woman who knows the value of a set table, even if no one sits across from her. A woman who doesn't need someone else's acknowledgement to know her love is real. And right there, in that soft moment of revelation, I understood that life still had more to show me. Not about that night, not about that dinner, but about myself, about what I carry, about what I will still live, about what I will still discover. The table didn't mark an ending. It marked a beginning. The beginning of a woman who looks at herself with depth, with dignity, with courage. A woman who recognizes her own worth and who, from that moment forward, will never again sit at tables where the only thing served is waiting. The faint light in the room illuminated only part of the path toward the hallway, but it was enough for me to notice something I had never seen before. I wasn't walking away smaller. I was walking away greater. Greater because I understood. Greater because I accepted. Greater because I allowed truth to find a place inside me. And that new strength rising within me wasn't made of wounded pride, but of restored self-love. A self-love that finally awakened after years in silence. And as I walked toward the doorway, ready to close that chapter within my own home, I felt something I hope you feel too. The certainty that your story does not end with someone else's abandonment, that your life does not shrink because someone failed to see your worth, that your essence is not defined by the gaze of those who choose to walk away. You continue, you rise, you grow, and there is something important you need to hear before you leave. Another story is waiting for you, a different story than this one, but filled with the same truth that touched something inside you just now. A new reflection, a new perspective, a new beginning that may reach a part of your soul you haven't opened in years. The next video appearing on your screen doesn't continue this narrative. It continues your journey, the journey of healing, of awareness, of rediscovering the strength you carry and may have forgotten. This journey doesn't end here. It simply changes direction. Tap the next video. Your story deserves to keep being illuminated, and your soul deserves every word that is still waiting for you.